Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica.
So you'll see around you in a lot of the...
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that, and the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me, I had a completely different...
About how I wrote the music, so with my background in sound...
Everything about Esther, for me, is a dream. To me, in games with game writing, this has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic languages, very exposition-y, very descriptive, very direct. And you'd have, like, art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe the character, tell the player what to do. And it just seemed like the most boring thing you could do with words in a game. And why couldn't a writer have the same artistic star clusters and all kinds of things like that? And we'll probably talk a bit more about kind of like hidden details and the secrets in the game as we go through. But that was really interesting for us in terms of the design of it, of going, you've got your kind of, your conscious, explicit play experience, but games are always constantly manipulating your mood and your feelings and the decision.
So something I wanted to do as a...
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, were your three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship, we don't want to set it in an Eastern European city, so it's got to be on this kind of like this desolate landscape, and we want to limit the player.
To use all of it, so the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music, but that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote.
I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in real life, but that's really cool, because I mean my thing about the White Lines is that it was this complete... Something that was missing in the original mod version was just this lack of a visual.
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about Celador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where, I think it's Chuck at that point is the vocalist before Mike Patton, just says, Dear Esther. Sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together, and to do it that way rather than writing a traditional plot as such. So yeah, Dear Esther, Faith No More and Doom, that's where it comes from.
Endless,
music, which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret.
So there's a lot of
When I was originally thinking that's really important, I think, that you're...
All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. And, it's really interesting, and it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you thought about what you... The radio mast in Dear Esther
as well, it helps you, it draws you in the right direction as you play the game. You can never get lost if you just follow that one landmark.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place of where that sort of traditional game design is still, there's loads of it in Esther, yeah. It's just not necessarily done in quite the same way.
So something you'll closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of very rotten. You know, everywhere you look, every rock, every grass surface, it has this layer of filth on it, and it's kind of been put in there just to kind of.
And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take, and we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character and the game was so strong that he just, without virtually any direction, inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance you can find an ultrasound picture. So as you leave the bothy and the seagull, the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2 because for what feels like.
So what made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively.
Which didn't understand that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about.
The music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things.
This is another of my favourite bits in the game, where you come along the edge of the sort of gully and you find hundreds of books, and it's one of the first times where most explicitly there's the suggestion that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment. But it works, I think, for me, because you just go...
One of the...
The caves in the game subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body.
It's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those. It's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself. But I think it is. I think particularly it does come again. Creative is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction kind of visit a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was champion
discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this,
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you at this point in the game is kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island. And it really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then you had like 4.
You come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind.
Disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the
moment of realisation for me, but
the motorway scene, the biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a complete.
Interesting rhythmical dynamic, and yeah, it's just about these ideas of hidden stories and layers, but it also starts to emphasise the obsessional nature, I think, of the story in Dear Esther, and his agitation and actually slight panic. So you're getting this rhythm.
It's probably the level which has changed. Interesting examples where I loved the image and the idea that you've got this guy painting the entire side of a mountain with words and symbols and things. But it was really interesting, when it went into the rebuild, it just never worked. And I think it was because the environment was so crude in the mod that those symbols and that painting became the focus of the level. And it changed the feeling of the level completely, when actually that just wasn't something we could realise in any way, that not even technically, but just didn't artistically look and feel right. And I think probably sort of retrospectively looking back on it, that's about the sort of the sophistication and the subtlety that.
Interesting to hear Dan talk about it sometimes, because there's some backstory that I've never even considered before, and obviously hearing Jess talk about it as well is really interesting, especially when it comes to the soundtrack. It makes me look at things in a very different way. So yeah, it's really interesting.
I think for me, like, making games is so inherently collaborative, and you have people coming together with different
repeats and repeats and repeats obsessively. So I think even if you don't understand that it's saying Esther, and even if you don't understand that it's Morse code, you're still getting this feeling of this obsessional repetition and slight panic that he has. And again, it's kind of it's the new chapter.
So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream. Paul on the road to Damascus is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and transformation.
For me, that's because it's about the struggle of being human, that it's hard and that we love and that we grieve and we lose, but we come through it. And those
very fluffy, but I think if you buy a game and someone says it's a walking simulator now, you've got a pretty good idea what you're getting. And there's been, there's Gone Home, Firewatch, Stanley Parable. There's so many other really good titles that kind of fall within that group of games out there now, that it does have an identity. And I think that's the really good thing about it. I mean, when Esther came out, there was literally nothing. We had no idea how we described it or what we called it.
We actually struggled with that quite a lot. When it
and sort of ended up being sort of like a ghost story, because it felt like it was the closest thing we could get. But it feels like now you can make a game like this and you can say it's a walking simulator and people will know what it is straight away.
I don't know, what do you guys think?
Well, I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative.
Around it is in a way. You're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of frame.
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you'll see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face. And these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of beyond this world, something kind of unsettling. And yeah, we've, you know, a lot of effort's been put in to make these things very subtle. I didn't really want them to be like, I didn't want it to be a ghost story, so to speak, but I just kind of wanted to bring some of this supernatural element into the game, and this area is probably...
There's no going back. You take a breath, and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense. And I think we did. I think it really came together here, that you got that sense of going, right, now this ends.
Significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious, and some of that.
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and, yeah, full-bodied. And then one of the string players said to me, "This is right."